Hi, this is a quick video to quickly go over the common phonological processes that might be present with children with speech sound disorder, but also we're also going to go through some of the typically developing phonological processes that a lot of children will have in the younger years as well. I've based these on the amazing book by, as you can see at the bottom there, by MacLeod and Baker, Children's Speech and Evidence-Based Approach to Assessment and Intervention. If you want to look more into these, that's pages 152 to 158 in that book. I haven't included them all, I've just included the vast majority of those phonological processes that I've commonly seen within the children that I work with speech sound disorder. Also, just need to say that within this, how I've done it, I've structured it in terms of structural processes, so those that change the structure of the word, and those systemic processes, substitutions. I've put the name of the phonological process on the left, then a quick description, and then an example. In my example, I have made sure that I've been using the phonetic symbols that we should be using as part of the RCSLT. So that's why you'll see some of the slightly different, potentially, vowels that you might not have used before. So the processes on the left as well are colour coded. You'll see green, orange, and kind of a pinky red. So the green are typical processes that can occur in typically developing children or those with phonological delay. And if you remember from the RCSLT curriculum guide, speech sound disorder guidance, that they can be classified as having a phonological delay if they are still doing some of these typical processes 6 months or more after they should have suppressed them. The orange are the less common, but still can be classified as typically developing and delayed phonological processes. So we'll go through those. And also the pinky red ones are some examples, not all, some examples of more atypical phonological processes. So those that might then tip them into that having that disordered profile, consistent phonological disorder, or other speech sound disorders. So a lot of these obviously might co-occur with articulation impairment, so articulation disorder, or motor speech, and be part of that profile, motor speech disorder such as childhood apraxia of speech or dysarthria. So just figuring out what processes they've got gives you some idea of what their subtype of speech sound disorder is, but it doesn't give you all the information. So that's all I'm doing today. I haven't put any ages in because that's another video where maybe I'd have to go through that diagnostic, how you can use these to diagnose into those subtypes. I just wanted to use this video just so you know some of the phonological processes and you hear examples of them. So we're going to start at the top. So the first one is reduplication. So that's when, in younger children, when second syllable becomes a replication of the first. So the examples I've given there are in the word water. That first syllable is war, and so what the child has done has just repeated it. So war, war. And then for biscuit, instead of saying biscuit, they've said bibby, which is, you can really hear that in very young children. Then you have weak syllable deletion. So that is omission of an stressed syllable. So a lot of people get confused between the weak syllable deletion, final consonant deletion. So hopefully this will clear those up. So if it's weak syllable deletion, it's usually that an unstressed syllable in a 2 or 3 or 4 syllable word has been omitted, the whole syllable. So on a word like banana, it would be nana. On a word like guitar, it would be tar. So it's got rid of that unstressed syllable, but the whole syllable, including the vowel, has been omitted in weak syllable deletion. For final consonant deletion, it's just your consonants or your consonant cluster that's gone. So that final consonant or the final consonant cluster at the end of a syllable has been deleted. So in a word like watch, that would be wa, and no vowels are deleted here, hence, so that would, if a vowel was deleted, that would be a syllable deletion, but this is just a final consonant deletion of that final consonant ch. That often occurs with plosives. So the word pig might be said as pi. for example. Then you have cluster reduction. So that's simplification of consonant clusters. That can be like two consonant cluster, two element consonant clusters, or three element consonant clusters, like sp and then spr. So if on the word spoon the s has been taken, has been omitted, then that's part of that consonant cluster. So that's gone to poon. That would be cluster reduction. The same would be if it was on the word like spr, like spring, and the child says sping, that will be cluster reduction. Or even if they said ping for spring and they've taken two away from that cluster, that three element cluster, that is still cluster reduction. That can occur at the beginning or at the end. So on a word like hand, if a child said han instead of saying hand, so that's the n d has been simplified down to a n, then that is also cluster reduction. Also should say that the structural processes, so if you look at the top, the structural processes, all of these change the structure of a word. So if you look at all of those four, what's happened is, especially for things like biscuit, that's a really good example. So that's gone from quite a complex word, from a consonant vowel, consonant, consonant vowel, consonant word, to just a consonant vowel, consonant vowel. It's completely changed the structure of the word. For weak syllable deletion, it obviously is going to, because it's going to take off a syllable completely. It's changed that structure. So from a consonant vowel, consonant vowel, consonant vowel, 3 syllable word, it's just gone to a 2 syllable word that consists of a consonant vowel, consonant vowel. With final consonant deletion, you are taking away the final consonant, so again affects the structure of a word, and again with cluster reduction takes that structure from a CCV word to a CC, from a CCV word to a CV word, for example. So let's go down to the ones that are still typical but less common. So this would be coalescence. So that would be, it's a bit more complicated. So features associated with two adjacent consonants combined into a new consonant. So let's go through that with this example. So for the word speak, and a child has said feek. So think about those two consonants at the beginning. You've got a s, which is an alveolar fricative, and then you've got the p, which is a bilabial plosive. And what that child has done to make it into a f is they've taken the fricative element from the s, so that manner of articulation, and they've taken the labial bit of the p and made it to a labial fricative. So that has combined those two things. So it's now gone to a labio-dental fricative. So that's what coalescence is. Then you've got epenthesis, which is insertion of a segment of a word, typically in a consonant cluster. So that's insertion of, usually it is a schwa vowel, and can occur when a child is getting used to doing clusters. So they've just started to master clusters. So I've put, oh, sorry, that's completely incorrect there, sorry. So the word is play, and the example is wrong. So you would say play. For that example that's there, the word would be please, and the child has said please. So they've added in that schwa vowel. Then metathesis, we've got reversal of the position of the two consonants. So there's two consonants and they've been reversed. Like they can be next to each other, or they can be a little bit further apart within the word. So for this example, for spaghetti, the child has said sketty. So they've changed over that s and p sound to a p and s cluster instead. For another example might be animal going to aminal. So they've changed reversed two of the consonants in those words. Then we have initial consonant deletion, which is our only atypical structural process. So that would be deletion of the initial consonant or consonant cluster at the start of a syllable. So that's very similar to your final consonant deletion, which is typical. But with children who do this, that will be classified as atypical, this initial consonant deletion. So that would be on a word like seen going to een. It would also include if you completely get rid of that consonant cluster. So let's look at the cluster reduction. above, that's spoon going to poon, which is completely typical. But if a child just said oon, that would be the complete omission of that cluster, which would be classified as initial consonant deletion and be atypical. So they're all your structural processes that change the structure of the word. Then you go down into the much more common the common subsystematic ones. I'm going to move myself up there so then you can see those a little bit clearer. So you've got velar fronting, which is completely typical from the velar to the alveolar position. That's the most common type of fronting. So that's your really typical thing of a child saying for the word key, saying T for, and then obviously making that the voiced velar plosive g into a d. So the word garden going to darden, for example. Then you've got palatal fronting, which is still classified as fronting, but it's a little bit less common. So from that post-alveolar to the alveolar position, so the sh going to a s, for example. So shark going to sark. And then you've got stopping, which is a replacement of the stops. So instead of replacing fricatives or affricates to a plosive, so that would be C to T, for example, or chair to tear. And then deaffrication is when an affricate is produced as a fricative. So let's just break that down a little bit. I've just said if an affricate is produced as a plosive, that's called stopping. But if an affricate, which as we can remember is a combination of a plosive and a fricative, so ch is a combination of a t plus a sh sound. If the child produces that as a fricative, that's called deaffrication. So it takes off that plosive at the start. So for that example here, I've said chip has gone to ship. That's deaffrication, which is again typical. Gliding of liquids, which is really typical and occurs up until quite late usually with children, even up until 5 or 6. So the liquids l and r are produced as y and w. Often the l goes to a y, the r goes to a w. So in the example I've given there, you've got leg gone to yeg, or the word ring going to wing, for example. That's gliding. Then you've got context sensitive voicing, which is a little bit more complex because there's 2 different types of this, but it's classified both of them as context sensitive voicing. So at the beginnings of words, so you get prevocalic voicing of word initial sounds. So for example, for a voiceless bilabial plosive, p, that's going to a b sound, so pig to big in our example, and that's really typical. And then usually at the ends of words, so postvocalically, so after the vowel, basically, postvocalically, you get that devoicing. So it's voicing at the beginning, devoicing at the end. So you're getting devoicing of word final consonants. So in this example, we've got bad going to bat. So that voiced plosive going to your voiceless alveolar plosive there. So that's typically what children do in that way round. So they'll voice at the beginning and they'll devoice at the end. Then you're going into the typical but a little bit less common ones. So you've got the alveolarization, which is basically what it sounds like. So you are making a labiodental, an alveolar. So the f sound is going to a s sound there. Then vocalization, which you hear quite often, I think, in certain accents anyway. Substitution of a syllabic consonant with a vowel. So on that example there, it's the l, which is the syllabic consonant. You tend to get l's and n's, so l and n are your syllabic consonants. So battle going to battle, bottle going to botter. And then labialization, so substitution of a non-labial with a labial. So I don't label this as fronting. It's a less common process. You want to kind of pick out those slightly more unusual ones, not as common ones. So I don't tend to classify labialization as fronting. I usually only save the word fronting for those velar fronting, palatal fronting ones if a child is producing a non-labial as a labial, slightly more unusual. So seen going to feen is not atypical, but I would still want to classify it as something else other than fronting. So that's their example there. So seen to feen. Then you've got quite a number of these atypical processes down here, which are systemic, the substitutions. There's obviously more than this, and there's a lot more children who might have idiosyncratic, so ones that they just use themselves that you've never heard before, that a child is just doing on their own. But here, these are some of the really common ones, common atypical processes that we've come across. So, and that are in that MacLeod book as well. There are a few others as well, but I've picked out a number of them. So backing is your one that most people quote. So that is your the opposite to your velar fronting. So you've got from the alveolar position to the velar position going back in the mouth. So you're going from a d to a g or a t to a k. So in this example, I've said deep to geep. There we go. And then we've got gliding of fricatives. So a substitution of a fricative with a glide. So that would be a child who doesn't say soft, that they like using those alveolar y and w sounds. So they might do feet to wheat. That often happens within consonant clusters as well. If you're trying to figure out what's going on, why are they using a w when it's I don't know, a slur. They might have just changed a couple of things in there to make it to a glide. So feet to wheat is the example there. Then you've got affrication, which is the opposite of deaffrication, but this is unusual because obviously affricates are more complex than your fricatives. So a child doing affrication is making life more difficult for themselves. They're using something that's more complex, which is unusual, and that's why it would be classified as an atypical process. So the example here as I've given is the z to a j. So zip to jip, which has maintained that voicing, but has turned it into an affricate. Then you've got glottal insertion, which is really something that tends to be something that I would pick up as almost a red flag for children who have a disordered speech profile. It often happens in the word medial positions. So obviously we have to discount those who are using them for accents. So for example, the word butter going to butter, I wouldn't classify that as a speech process at all. That's just an accent feature often, depending on where you live, obviously. But if a child is inserting a glottal against fricatives and things like that instead of fricatives, then that's much more unusual. I've had children who have inserted glottal stops or the fricative sound. So in this example, wishing to whitting, or they could do whihing, which is really unusual. So that would be a bit of a red flag for a disordered profile, and definitely would be an atypical process. This last one is a bit more complex. So systemic sound preference. That is when a child has a favourite sound that they will use for lots of other different phonemes, lots of other different sounds, other speech sounds. It might be that they have so many of those typically developing, those green ones up here, that they might be velar fronting, and they might be stopping, and they might be voicing. But because they're doing all of those things, and because they're also cluster reducing, that means that so many phonemes or phoneme clusters are said as the same sound. So then that pushes them into being atypical. So let's give an example for this. So if a child uses f for every single fricative, which is unusual in itself, that would be disordered. Even every single one would be disordered, apart from a v to a f would be devoicing. But if a s goes to a f, obviously that's an unusual one. But if they use it for all, that will be then push them into that systemic sound preference and would be classified as atypical. A more common one would be if a child is fronting and stopping and voicing, and also cluster reducing maybe. That would mean that they would use a d for t, k, g, s, z, maybe sh, zh, and also those s blends as well. So that would mean that they would be really hard to understand. And even though they've only got those quite common, typical processes, because they've got so many of them, we can classify those children as having a systemic sound preference, and that would push them into that phonological disorder, and that will be classified as a disordered process overall. So yeah, that's really interesting. So that's a bit more of a complex one. I hope that helps with your kind of understanding of phonological processes. Please comment below about other videos that you might want as well. So thank you very much.